The second son of the king bears three titles, each rich with meaning. His initial role is last resort, ready to become king should illness or iniquity prevent the heir apparent from fulfilling his ancestral responsibilities. His second title, first consul, is granted after the heir apparent fulfills his destiny by marrying, giving his soul safely into his future queen's keeping. Eventually, when he marries, he assumes his most sacred role, keeper of the soul of Estolia. Ulysses Anatoli, Capitulo 37.
Annabel gently stroked Estrella's nose, the filly who had become her sole companion since her mother's illness. Hearing her father call her name, she paused to embrace Estrella's sturdy golden neck. Then she left the stable and headed to the house shared with her parents. As she entered the house, a motion in her peripheral vision caught Annabel's attention. She turned to find her mother standing next to the empty crib, aiming an object at her. Instinctively, she ducked, watching without alarm as a dish shattered against the nearby wall. Her father quietly offered her mother a cup of mead, laced with a soporific drug he had traded from a passing merchant. After her mother settled into the padded corner of the kitchen she preferred, Annabel asked,
"Yes, father?"
He looked up, his eyes wet with tears tracing down his cheeks.
Duke Ortega has spoken with me. He refuses to marry you.
Given her mother's recent behavior, she was not surprised. What did surprise her was his willingness to lose face by calling off their betrothal. She overheard some of the milkmaids discussing her mother's latest escapade. In their opinion, they believed that Duke Ortega would strangle her on their marriage bed. It was, in their view, the only way to cure himself of being tainted by the spawn of a woman possessed by demons.
He does not wish you harm,
her father said. His voice was weary.
But he is in a very difficult position.
What is to be done then?
She asked.
You must be seen to spurn him permanently,
he replied. She glanced between her father and her mother's bedraggled figure. Before her injury, her mother had been the most beautiful woman in all of Palmara.
How, father?
She asked. The Duke desired Annabel for the beauty inherited from her mother. The burden of her mother's influence on her life, her future, everything, weighed heavily on her. Annabel wondered if her father was telling her that she was still to be strangled. He started to cross the room towards her, but her mother clutched his ankle, muttering incoherently. He glanced down, then back up.
Hieros sails at dawn. Before that, at high tide. If you leave with him, he'll let you disembark within swimming distance of Pequeño.
She had heard of Pequeño. Some sailors claimed it rivaled Izquierdo or even Palmara in size. Eavesdropping on the Christian priest, she learned Pequeño was home to an unholy religion that sacrificed maidens at dawn. Other whispers spoke of a woman killed in a ceremony there a few years back. If she had grasped her father's meaning, she was being banished to Pequeño. Despite her reputed beauty, Duke Ortega suspected she would inherit more than her mother's looks. Most in Palmara feared she'd inherit her mother's illness too.
Do you think Theros will keep his promise?
She asked, a creeping dread suggesting she might be strangled or have her throat cut by sunset tomorrow.
Cathaya arrived here with Duke Ortega and Thieros,
he replied. She stumbled forward, then to the side, managing to sit before the shock could knock her down. Cathaya was divinatra, her word was law in Palmara. No one, not even the pirates tolerated by merchants, dared defy her. Cathaya left her modest home only when the spirit whispered truths to her. To Annabel, she was the most beautiful woman on the island.
She insisted that Theros, Duke Ortega, and I speak together.
He glanced down at her mother, peacefully asleep from the soporific. Bending, he gently freed his pants from her grip and moved towards Annabel, opening his arms wide with a beseeching expression. She crossed the room, allowing her father to enfold her in his trembling embrace. After a while, he broke away, guiding her towards the far corner of their living room.
Cathaya declared that Duke Ortega cannot marry you. She said the omens are unfavorable due to your mother's latest outburst. He expressed no desire to see his progeny take root within you.
A blush on her cheeks signaled her recognition of his intention to strangle her on their marital bed.
Cathaya warned that if Duke Ortega directly or indirectly caused your death, the calamities following him would be countless. She proclaimed his entire family would endure suffering, misery and disaster, and his legacy would be less than the ashes of defeat. He'd witnessed the end of his lineage before facing his own death. I've never seen her appear so formidable. We all felt certain she had a vision of the future that would come true if her prophecy was ignored. She turned to Tyros, declaring that any man who betrayed his promise concerning your fate in the next 2 days would suffer the same grim end.
I don't understand, Father.
Cathaya says your future lies on Pequeño. Duke Ortega must compensate me for rejecting you while saving face. He's paying Theros to take you to Pequeño. Board before dawn, and he promises to deliver you by sunset. Cathaya will pay him once he returns.
But Father, what I've heard about Pequeño...
she began.
Cathaya insists the only way you'll find happiness is if you go to Pequeño.
She recalled the unruly stallion her father nurtured, hand-fed and attempted to tame for profit. She remembered the day he proudly climbed onto the animal to demonstrate its training, only for the stallion to whirl and kick her mother violently. For 3 days, they feared she would die, but against all odds she began to recover. Her father slit the stallion's throat in the desperate moments after the accident, when he thought her mother was lost. Yet, she survived. Only after her mother's bruised eyes mended did they realize something was terribly wrong. The healer claimed the stallion's malevolent soul invaded her body, that she died, and her body turned into a vessel for the creature's dark spirit. Her mother began speaking in strange tongues and behaving in ways that convinced the townspeople she was possessed. Just 3 days earlier, she had been seen in a passionate embrace with one of Duke Ortega's dimmest guards. Possession was rare, but once it struck a family, it would infect the children as well. For Annabelle, being her mother's mirror image, she was vulnerable to demonic possession, or that her children would become demon spawn.
I do not wish to go.
She murmured, her voice small and resigned, knowing she had little choice. Staying meant risking Duke Ortega's wrath.
What about Estrella?
Cathaya insists you bring Estrella, but nothing else,
her father said. The moon had yet to rise above the horizon. A blanket of clouds concealed the stars, casting the night into deep darkness. Theros approached Annabelle, who stood with Estrella on the ship's deck. Her rough-spun monk's robe hid her waist-long curly black hair and the curves of her figure. He eyed the horse wistfully and shook his head.
Damn shame I've got to keep my word. That filly would fetch a lot on his Kirdo.
After grunting, he spat on the deck.
The witch told me I'd be tempted to break my word. She said the game wouldn't be worth it. I knew a man who ignored her once.
Memories clouding his gaze, he growled,
Get on the damn horse.
She glanced at the pitch-black water and understood he planned to put her overboard. A protest formed on her lips.
She said to bring you here and let you off the ship, both you and the damn horse. If you refuse, I get to do as I please with you and sell the horse. Decide quickly. In 5 seconds, I'll consider you mine.
She untied Estrella's lead rope, swung onto her back and led the horse toward the gap in the railing. Leaning forward, she prayed to survive and urged her mount to leap. The impact of hitting the water and submerging nearly made her cry out, but she quickly remembered to keep her mouth shut and hold her breath. They surfaced rapidly, and relief washed over her at the horse's powerful instincts. From the first stroke, Estrella swam with purpose, while her rider could only offer encouraging words and gentle caresses against her neck. Much later, she reflected that Estrella had heart. They reached the shore, utterly spent. As the moon rose, trees emerged in the distance. After dismounting to ease her companion's burden, they trudged from the water, limbs heavy and waterlogged toward the trees. The rocky beach slowed their progress. Soon, the horse halted, lowering her head in exhaustion. Sharing the same fatigue, she curled up at her feet, wrapping the lead rope around her hand.
was etched in stone, a destiny decreed, a path unknown, a dawn connection, they ride as one into the rising of the sun.
When I first started transcribing all the ensayos and capítulos into Tamrin's beautiful Estolian typeface, I never imagined the magnitude of the gifts I would give and receive. Internalizing the writings of every Estolian before me was a marvel itself. But then came the writings of the Adios. Deity asked me to read and transcribe them, granting Jeremiah and me profound spiritual growth. Oddly, the capstone of this project, which seemed trivial at first, turned out to be transcribing nearly 2,400 years of maintenance records. From Tremaine's later years as keeper of the soul of Estolia, artisans and acolytes meticulously recorded everything. Hidden in those pages lay true treasures, just waiting to be discovered. Kaylee Zakarian Inscrito.
Alexandros strained to glimpse the woman's features, but she stood silhouetted against the sunset. Her outline blocked the sinking glow of the orb as it disappeared into the sea. Her scent, richer than Mayberry blossoms, enveloped him. He felt her hand on his face, the warmth of her aura more intense and real than any he had read in the capítulos. In less than 4 hours, he would claim her, make her his, and take the next, most critical step in the transition. Finally, he would step into the role his brother spurned. This beautiful woman was his reward for listening to the spirit. If only he could see her face. As she stepped into the light, he was horrified to see it was Patriciala, blood streaming from her slit throat. Alexandros jolted awake, soaked in sweat from the horror of his recurring dream. Seeing a shadowy figure bending over him, he cried out in alarm, only to find it was Ulysses.
"What is it?"
he asked. Ulysses, leaning on one of his crutches, expertly lit the lamp beside the bed. He seemed peculiar, oddly resolute.
It is your birthday.
Ulysses declared.
Today you must find the keeper of your soul, your Kaylee.
Alexandros shuddered, recalling his dream. He believed in deity and everything he was taught, yet it seemed odd to think he could simply wake up and find his Kaylee on this particular day. He'd met the few eligible women and knew none in all of Estolia fit him. What if finding her proved impossible? His mind flicked to the dagger. Would Ulysses need to wield it? Abruptly, he pushed these thoughts aside and refocused on his friend.
Rise, Alexandros. We must ride to the sea, near the salt marshes, east of the Willowall caves, where the river of Deity empties into the sea. Our horses are ready. We must go, now.
Ulysses's determination was undeniable. Once again, Alexandros marveled at his friend's agility, despite having only 1 foot. Ulysses wielded his crutches and canes as extensions of himself and exuded an indefinable presence from his mobile chair. To Alexandros, it was clear that Ulysses would masterfully lead the Estolian faith, with more authority than any previous keeper, except perhaps Amador and his successor, Hezekiah, Zakarian's second son. In front of the palace stood 4 horses, 3 saddled and 1 carrying a small burden tied to its back. Alexandros wasn't certain what insight Ulysses had gained from deity, but it was clear his friend had experienced a vision and had prepared meticulously for their outing. With practiced ease, Ulysses mounted the short, stocky mare he preferred. She had learned to respond to his signals on one side only, becoming incredibly attuned to his cues with the bridle. Once Alexandros was certain that Ulysses was settled, he mounted his stallion. He was looking forward to discovering what his cousin and deity had planned.
I am certain, Alexandros, your destiny awaits us.
"I honor your connection to deity,"
he said.
"Your spirituality is invaluable to me, Ulysses. No other Estolian is as qualified as you to guide me. You will help me become the king I am meant to be. I trust your lead in this and in all spiritual matters. Guide me, my friend."
As they descended the palace road, Alexandros replayed his dream. Something felt different. Though he had dreamed of Patriciala many times, this was the first time he distinctly dreamed about his Kaylee, the aura, and his birthday. Previously, he had seen Patriciala in various roles, feeding the Willowalls, riding her horse, dancing with Apollyon, always with her throat cut. Once confirmed by Deity, his actions were justified. He would, however, forever feel the anguish of the death of Apollyon and Patriciala, shuddering at the memory of his hand ending their lives. When he looked at the dark silhouette of Ulysses, he vowed fervently to serve Estolia, her citizens, and the promise of Zacharias with every breath, until the end of his life. From the moment he accepted his role as last resort, he was bound to the will of Deity in all things.
At dawn they meet, their destinies aligned. The keeper guides, the air refined. Stuck in twilight, a shimmering echo of the skies, bright memory imprinted in my eyes, silver lining of storm clouds fine.
As a child, I often wondered if my father ever thought about me and what those thoughts might have been. For the first 6 years of my life, I had only my mother, and I've been told that the mentally gifted can recall their early years with unusual clarity. I remember Violet and the things Mother used to say, like how cruel it was to separate us, knowing we'd hate her all our lives for it, even though we were twins. What my early memory fails to reveal is why she chose to part us. In my search for Violet, I was horrified to discover the fate of the family that fostered her. Every member dead, diseased, addicted, or jailed, with no trace of Violet. Until I know her fate, there will be an emptiness in my soul. Personal Journal of Sage G.
By the time they arrived at the rocky Ankamun beach, the pre-dawn sky was streaked with thin streamers of peach, yellow, and pink. Ulysses turned his mare northward, urging her into a swift, ground-eating canter along the shoreline path. A few minutes into the ride, Alexandros's steed whickered, a sound he recognized as his stallion sensing a nearby filly in heat. The filly's neigh reverberated through the dawn air, and within moments, Alexandros struggled to keep control. From the graying light, Ulysses' voice reached him.
No use fighting it. You might as well dismount.
Alexandros came to the same conclusion. His stallion was soon courting a yellow filly, wasting no time. He shook his head, suddenly curious if Ulysses intended this outing to find a mate for him or his horse. As he walked toward the pair, he nearly tripped over someone lying prone on the rocky beach. He knelt to check if the person was dead or alive. As the rising sun peered over the horizon, he rolled the woman over and couldn't believe her beauty. Her dark hair glowed in the morning sunlight, adding an ethereal quality. Gently he pulled her onto his lap, knowing the rocky beach would be uncomfortable. Her skin felt almost luminous, like a warm ember that didn't burn. Glancing at Ulysses, still perched smugly on his mare, Alexandros understood the purpose of the extra horses. He'd need to ensure her safe return to the palace.
I brought something for her to wear.
Ulysses said, nodding toward the pack horse.
Her clothing is unsuitable.
Alexandros glanced at her, noticing she wore an outfit resembling Ulysses' temple garb. Her eyes fluttered open, meeting his gaze before scanning Ulysses on his mare, the other horses, and finally, the yellow mare's liaison with his stallion.
Is this Pequeño?
She inquired in Palmaran. He answered in the same language.
While those traversing the seas of Centrarth call it Pequeño, we who live here refer to it as Estolia.
How many people live here?
She inquired.
Quite a few. It's not as small as its reputation suggests.
Because it was perceived to be small, few people had much curiosity about it.
Estolia?
She said the name carefully, pronouncing it the way he did.
I am Annabelle, daughter of Raoul, prime artisan of Palmara.
I am Alexandros Martavius, descendant of Zacharian, the first son of Zacharias.
After a pause, he asked,
Can you stand?
She nodded and rose with Alexandros steadying her. He gestured to Ulysses.
This is my most trusted advisor, Ulysses, son of Paratarsus.
Ulysses gestured toward his missing foot.
I hope you'll forgive me for not dismounting.
She nodded, a flicker of sorrow briefly crossing her face. Her gaze shifted from him to the mare and stallion, now peacefully grazing on the sweet marsh grasses after their tryst.
How did you come to be here?
Ulysses inquired, his understanding of the nuances of Palmyran less polished than Alexandros's. She glanced at him, her eyes lowering.
I was banished.
She replied softly.
From Palmyra?
He questioned. She nodded, eyes fixed on her feet.
What crime did you commit?
Ulysses pressed further. She glanced at Ulysses, then turned to Alexandros.
Mother was kicked in the head by a horse as black as night. She was never the same after. People claim she is possessed by its malevolent spirit.
She paused.
As her daughter, and one who has a connection to horses,
She pointed to the yellow mare.
it's said I'm either already possessed or I will be. I am the embodiment of evil. The Duke.
Her voice trailed off and she shuddered.
Tell us about the Duke.
Ulysses' voice was implacable, insistent. Her chin lifted defiantly, eyes meeting his in the brightening dawn.
Duke Ortega was to marry me. People whispered that he would strangle me on our wedding night to prevent his heir from inheriting my cursed blood.
She took a deep, steadying breath, swallowing before continuing.
My father forced Duke Ortega to pay Thieros to bring me and Estrella to Pequeño's coast, telling me I had to swim for it or let Thieros claim me.
So you arrive in Estolia, exiled from Palmyra, intending to live here without the king's consent?
Ulysses' tone was icy and unyielding. Alexandros opened his mouth to argue with Ulysses, ready to offer her sanctuary in Estolia. Yet, just as words formed, he recalled promising Ulysses only hours before that he'd defer to him in all matters spiritual. Her lips trembled, a tear glistening in her lashes without falling.
What must I do?
She asked, her voice barely audible.
You must be acceptable to the king.
Ulysses replied.
He might even ask you to marry his son.
He straightened on his mare, adding,
Are you willing to do that to stay in Estolia?
She cast a pleading look at Alexandros.
I didn't intend to trespass. I was told I had to stay on Pequeño. How can I ask the king to let me stay?
You must wear proper clothing rather than religious garb.
Ulysses said.
We will take you to the king. Be ready to do as he commands. If you do not have the courage to follow his command, board the next ship leaving Estolia, never to return.
She bowed her head, nodding as her shoulders sagged. Alexandros wished to reassure her that she would be safe in Estolia, even though Ulysses deemed this necessary. She accepted the package he offered and slipped behind her golden filly, changing into the simple attire Ulysses had given her. As she finished dressing, the dawn's colors nearly faded away. She emerged as a stunning beauty. As she approached where Alexandros stood beside his stallion, he noticed a visual echo, a shimmering afterimage trailing her, reminiscent of the silver-white edges of billowing storm clouds, intense enough to linger in one's vision. He frowned, glancing at Ulysses, perplexed by what he saw. Their eyes met, and Ulysses gave a slight nod, acknowledging the sight before them. It wasn't until Alexandros helped her onto the spare mount that he realized he was witnessing her aura. Her touch lingered, leaving a radiant echo imprinted on his skin. Her presence resonated through his entire being, touching both body and soul. With the golden filly following closely, Ulysses forged ahead, setting a blistering pace back to the palace. The horses, visibly weary, cantered to a halt before the palace steps. Acolytes swiftly approached, taking hold of the horses' bridles to steady them as the trio dismounted. One acolyte retrieved Ulysses' crutches from the pack horse, handing them to him carefully after he dismounted. Several acolytes arrived with Ulysses' mobile chair. Climbing the stairs to the grand entrance, unaided, often took considerable time, so he preferred being conveyed up in the chair for efficiency. Nodding in gratitude to the acolytes, he settled into the chair. With practiced ease, the four acolytes swiftly brought him to the top. Alexandros and Annabel ascended the stairs behind Ulysses, who continued without pause upon reaching the top. She turned to Alexandros, asking,
Who is he?
He is destined to be the next spiritual leader.
Alexandros replied.
Do you think the king will allow me to stay?
She inquired.
I am certain of it.
He said truthfully, though he wondered why Ulysses was so reserved with her. Glancing at Annabel made him dizzy, so he chose to focus on climbing the stairs. As they reached the top, several acolytes stood stoically by the entrance, giving the impression of perpetual sentinels.
Ulysses is consulting with the king.
An acolyte informed Alexandros in the Estolian tongue.
He requests you escort the princess to the small breakfast room. A meal will be served, and the king will see her afterward.
He bowed his head, acknowledging that he must follow Ulysses' plan, likely being discussed with Alexandros' father, the king. Turning to Annabel, he marveled at the striking intensity of her aura, saying,
The king will see us after breakfast. Please, follow me and we'll have something to eat.
I stood alone as morning came, looking out across these rolling hills. Something stirred within my heart that day, a voice that wouldn't keep still. And in that moment everything changed, when heaven's light began to spill.
I experienced a most peculiar dream. A figure resembling Hollywood's version of God told me I would never be California's governor. He sported a flowing white beard and thick white hair that glowed with an otherworldly light. He had a commanding, fierce presence. But as our conversation wound down, curiosity drove me to ask, "Who are you?"
I am time, Krenos, the antithesis of eternity.
That cryptic reply hardly illuminated my confusion. In an instant he vanished in a flash of golden light. I was left cursing my own foolishness for fixating on his identity, while his proclamation about the election loomed larger. Like fleeting mist, the details of the dream slipped away, leaving only shadows of our exchange. Yet one thing lingered. He emphasized that my granddaughter needed to know I faced my destiny with pride, confident that my life would carry a divine significance. Although I recognized it was just a dream, I take promises seriously. So I hurriedly jotted down what little I could remember in my journal. Sleep beckoned me. But as I glanced over my plans for tomorrow's rally, the final push before the election, I felt anticipation swell within. Standing alongside Riley and my son-in-law would be a moment to savor. Despite Krenos' dire prediction, a wave of confidence washed over me. It was time for a change of paradigm. Glial Ru. Final diary entry, November 1st, 1992.
Annabel studied the handsome man who had been by her side since she awoke on Pequeño, curiosity bubbling within her about his true identity. The palace stretched before her, more magnificent than anything she had ever beheld. Not even Duke Ortega of Palmara dwelled in such a grandiose abode. Thoughts of Duke Ortega creased Annabel's brow. The islands, each governed by its own duke, owed allegiance to the king of Anoxes. Yet overhearing their conversations, it seemed as though the islanders believed in having their own sovereign. Memories of a past rebellion on Izquierdo surfaced, where the duke declared himself the king. In response, the king of Anoxes dispatched his armada to swiftly quash the uprising, replacing the defiant duke with one more amenable to Anoxes' rule. Lost in thought, Annabel followed Alexandros to a cozy breakfast room. His easy manner within the palace walls suggested a deep familiarity. As they encountered others, he received warm greetings devoid of the pomp and circumstance Duke Ortega demanded. Only after she savored the delightful breakfast did a snippet of their earlier conversation return to her mind. She directed a frown at Alexandros.
Who are you, Alexandros?
She inquired.
You mentioned Ulysses as your advisor, yet also said he is to become the next spiritual leader.
Just as Alexandros was about to reply, the door to the breakfast room swung open, revealing a striking figure. The man, significantly older than Ulysses or Alexandros, had a beard that tapered to a point. Draped in a robe reminiscent of the one she had worn during her escape from Palmyra, he commanded attention. What captivated her most was the royal purple thread intricately embroidered into the robe, a hue of immeasurable value. The robe's needlework was a masterpiece, with intricate designs woven from purple thread accented by vibrant green and gleaming gold, alongside deep black and warm brown shades. The green matched the vivid hue of spring leaves, while the gold shimmered in the sunlight, unmistakably crafted from precious metal. Never had she seen attire of such opulence. This was the most expensive garment she had ever beheld. His eyes, filled with curiosity, lingered on her before shifting to Alexandros. After clearing his throat, he announced,
"His Highness, the King of Estolia, has granted the young woman an audience."
He motioned towards the open door. Annabel stood, relieved when Alexandros accompanied her to the audience chamber. Ulysses had implied that the king might expect her to wed his son. She was unfazed by such a prospect. Her father had always seen her as an asset, a valuable commodity for trade to increase his wealth, so the notion of being wed to one of the king's sons felt like just another aspect of a well-worn narrative. Her thoughts scattered as she entered a small hall where a man sat regally on a throne. A thick crown adorned his head, and a cape embroidered with exquisite purple, green, and gold draped his shoulders. Guided by her escort, she moved to stand before him, the weight of his gaze upon her. Ulysses, supported by crutches, approached. He wore robes similar to the older man's, enhanced by a striking black sash extending from his right shoulder to his left hip.
Annabel, may I introduce Augustus Minifred, descendant of Zacarian, king and sovereign of Estolia.
He faced her with a nod.
Your Majesty, this is Annabel, daughter of Raoul, prime artisan of Palmyra.
She curtsied, yet confusion furrowed her brow as she contemplated how this man held the title of king rather than duke.
"What troubles you?"
the king inquired gently. Glancing from the king to the other men, she replied,
I was unaware that there was any king other than the king of Enoxes. He declared the leader of each island a duke.
The king laughed.
"So, I am also the Duke of Estolia, as well as being her sovereign?"
Unsure how to respond to his levity, she remained silent. Her unease stifled his laughter. His voice solemn, he said,
"You have arrived in Estolia without permission. Are you aware that only those with permission walk her shores?"
I apologize sincerely. I never intended to offend. There is nowhere else for me to turn.
He gave a quick nod, eyes darting to Ulysses before settling back on her.
"I hear you were promised to Duke Ortega of Palmyra."
I was.
She responded quietly.
He cast me out.
"For the sin of being a witch's daughter?"
The king inquired. Her nod came slowly.
He didn't want his heir tainted by my blood.
She confessed, stealing a glance at Ulysses.
"We do not accept foreigners easily,"
the king stated.
She must marry your son.
Ulysses interjected.
It is the only way for her to remain in Estolia.
"My son must agree to this,"
the king countered. Annabel felt a rush of uncertainty. She had no words for the tumultuous thoughts swirling inside her. Alexandros, silent throughout the tense exchange, finally spoke up.
"She is not Estolian. She does not grasp the weight nor the implications of acceptance."
He glanced at her before looking back at the king. Ulysses limped closer and stood in front of her.
Will you accept the terms set before you?
She looked from him to each of the other men in the room before squaring her shoulders and lifting her chin.
I will do whatever it takes to remain in Estolia for the rest of my life.
Ulysses spoke with a measured tone.
Tonight you shall proceed to the temple, to the seclusion suite. The king's son will meet you there. If he deems you acceptable, a promise of marriage will be made by morning.
She longed to protest, to question and understand, but something in Ulysses' gaze silenced her objections. With a decisive nod, she accepted her fate. If the king's son found her acceptable, she would marry him. The stark reality was that no other future lay before her.
For now,
Ulysses spoke with a measured tone.
You will go with Delphina to prepare for this evening.
He gestured to a simple serving girl.
My children grow and teach them what these titles mean. I tell them of that dawn's sweet glow and all the wisdom I have seen.
Once the beautiful woman left the audience chamber, Alexandros looked at his cousin curiously.
I have never heard of this type of requirement,
he said.
The last resort has also never become the heir apparent before.
Ulysses reminded him.
I felt moved by the spirit to do this, create this situation. Make sure she accepts you before you consummate the union, and then everything else is up to you.
She does not even know that I am the man she is to wed,
he said.
That is why she must accept you before you place your soul within her keeping.
They wanted titles grand and bold to match the kingdoms far and wide. But I remembered what was told when dawn broke on that mountainside. 3 names of clay, not crowns of gold, would be the way our land would ride.
She holds my hand so carefully as merchants call our way. The morning sun is warm and bright on cobblestones so gray. Mayberry blossoms in the air, sweet memories we share.
The third title given to the first son of the king of Estolia is as light-hearted as the 3 given to the second son are serious. When the king of Anoxes declared himself sovereign of the islands, he demoted the local leaders to the rank of duke. For the leadership of Estolia, the symmetry of having 3 titles for both the heir apparent and the future keeper led to the somewhat humorous adoption of the title, resulting in formal introductions enumerating all 3: Duke, Sovereign, and King of Estolia. Ulysses Anatoli. Capitulo 37.
Delphina's shy gaze met Annabel's as she approached. Silently, Delphina touched a thick, angry scar across her throat, lips parting without a sound. It was a gesture that spoke volumes. In understanding, Annabel followed her to a sumptuous bedchamber, the silence between them filled with unspoken stories. Inside the bedchamber, Delphina attended to Annabel with gentle care, washing, brushing, and lovingly styling her hair. Though much of the sand and salt was rinsed away, the full luxury of a bath eluded her, leaving Annabel only partially cleansed. By mid-afternoon, Annabel felt truly pampered. Delphina presented her with a cream-colored dress, its fabric soft and gentle on the skin, and adorned with a delicate purple flower embroidered on one sleeve, a touch of elegance that caught the eye. Seated gracefully in one of the ornate chairs, Annabel was lost in thought when a gentle tap on the door announced Ulysses. With the steady rhythm of his cane, he limped into the room, each step speaking of past struggles. As Annabel rose, a swirl of questions danced eagerly through her mind.
You have had your needs met?
He asked her.
They have.
She replied.
And now?
Ulysses' attention focused intently on her.
I am to escort you to the temple,
he informed her, reaching out a hand.
There you will meet the prince.
Why aren't you concerned about my mother?
I don't subscribe to the kind of possession you've mentioned. It strikes me as more of an illness. Rest assured, I see no danger in you marrying the prince.
Something is disturbing you,
Annabel observed.
You are a stranger to Estolia,
he remarked with a sigh.
Acceptance of this future must come before the prince consummates the union. It is essential you embrace it without delay.
I have already accepted.
And so you have,
he agreed.
Come.
Annabel followed Ulysses back to the grand entrance of the palace. With a practiced ease, he settled into his mobile chair. As they descended, Annabel's gaze fell on Estrella, poised at the foot of the steps, adorned with an intricate saddle. Despite the exhausting swim from the previous night, Estrella seemed unfazed. Upon hearing her name, Estrella whickered joyfully, the sound a clear indication of her happiness at being reunited with her mistress. Once one of the young men helped her mount, Annabel patiently awaited Ulysses' own preparations. As she waited, her mind drifted back to her initial arrival, emblazoned with the image of Alexandros's powerful stallion with her filly. The parallel struck her, expectations of union with a stranger, surrendering to an unfamiliar authority, much like Estrella was compelled to submit to the stallion. Her thoughts drifted to Alexandros, the embodiment of her ideal partner. But her father's promise to Duke Ortega left her desolate at the prospect of marrying a man she barely knew, let alone desired. The priestess Cathaya listened to Annabel's worries, yet offered little solace. Duke Ortega's reputation lacked any warmth. His first wife lost her life in childbirth, and the second passed mere months after their daughter's birth. All Duke Ortega sought was a male heir. The idea of his primal demands, overpowering and unfeeling, filled her with dread. Yet she saw no path away from this fate. The men she encountered in Estolia so far were a visual relief compared to Duke Ortega, especially Alexandros. Her heartbeat quickened at the thought of him. His sincerity and genuine care stood out, along with an honesty that was rare in her world. She had noticed his unease when Ulysses announced her future marriage to the king's son. Did Alexandros see her and wish to claim her for himself? As they neared the imposing cathedral, Annabel expected it to be their destination. The sight of its towering spires and intricate stonework filled her with a sense of awe. But Ulysses continued past it, guiding her instead toward a pair of grand double doors carved into the very heart of the mountain. The whispers about this land replayed in Annabel's mind, weaving a web of uncertainty and fear. Many were contradictory, yet one haunting tale stood out, concerning the prince himself. Rumors claimed he had slit his young wife's throat. Some insisted it was a random act of brutality, others spoke of revenge, while yet another account suggested it was a common practice among the people of Pequeño. The most chilling rumor murmured repeatedly in her thoughts.
They need women because when they marry, so many don't meet their standards. Failing that, they cut their throats.
The memory of it sent a shiver down her spine as she pondered the truth behind these stories.
Come, I will guide you to the seclusion chamber. The prince will soon join you.
With careful effort, Ulysses ascended the 10 steps leading to the majestic doors. As they neared, the doors opened with a silent grace, revealing the wonders within. Annabel gasped softly, enraptured by the temple's serene beauty. It was as if the very walls whispered serenity to her soul, enveloping her in a tranquil embrace. They proceeded through a wide hallway and entered a grand chamber, clearly intended for ceremonies or special gatherings. It took Annabel back to the amphitheater on Palmyra's east coast, a relic from Rome's occupation. The tiers of seats formed an impressive circle around them, with a modest dais raised on one side. Ulysses guided her past the dais, through a pair of smaller double doors. The hallway on the other side was spectacular, stretching much longer and more ornate than the previous one. Finally, Ulysses paused before yet another pair of imposing double doors. Annabel paused, taken aback by the chamber's striking beauty. A wall of shutters lay open, revealing a narrow garden where 3 trees stood, cloaked in a breathtaking abundance of deep purple blossoms. Her imagination whimsically transformed the trees into 3 maidens, adorned for her wedding. Her bridesmaids, she mused. Annabel caught her breath, astonished by the beauty of the trees, which stirred another kind of beauty within her, a memory. It was a spring day, much like this one, when she was an awkward child with lanky limbs and a flat chest. She walked by her mother's side through the bustling merchant district, where rumors of a newly docked ship carrying exotic treasures filled the air. Her mother sang lightly, weaving through the throngs of people.
"Your father has received a commission from the Duke,"
she had said, her voice a melody over the commotion.
"He suggested I come here to find a gift."
Annabel watched her mother laugh, and in that moment she wholeheartedly agreed with her father. Her mother was indeed the most beautiful woman in the world.
"Perfumes, coal, powders for perfection."
A short man with a barrel chest emerged before them, exuding a scent of garlic and spices. He brandished a small beaded glass bottle and with a squeeze released a fragrant mist into the air. Annabel was captivated by the exquisite aroma, spinning joyfully in circles while her mother discussed business with the merchant. Though Annabel lost track of how her mother's shopping concluded, She vividly recalled the merchant kneeling before her, his eyes sparkling as he complimented her radiant smile, turning that moment into a cherished memory of warmth and delight.
A beautiful young lady. You may very well be a duchess someday,
he said, a broad grin lighting up his face.
Now open your mouth, little lady, and close your eyes.
His voice danced with playful mischief, hinting at a delightful surprise as he held out a tempting sweet, inviting her to indulge in a moment of simple joy. Annabel glanced at her mother, who smiled encouragingly, prompting her to go along with the surprise. A heartbeat later, her taste buds were overwhelmed by an explosion of flavor as something delightful melted on her tongue. Eyes still closed, she reveled in the sweet's rich taste, the world around her fading as she focused entirely on the magical moment. As Annabel opened her eyes, the merchant's grin widened mischievously.
Now do you have your handkerchief, little lady?
He asked, his tone playful, as if he had a clever trick or a mystery just waiting to unfold. With a hint of shyness, Annabel extended her small kerchief to the merchant, her eyes growing wide with wonder as he delicately spritzed it with the same enchanting perfume. Handing it back to her, he tousled her hair affectionately, leaving her with a treasured keepsake and a heart full of warmth. The gentle aroma of the blossoms whisked her back to that cherished day with the merchant. It was clear that whatever magic his perfume held, this very flower was at its heart, crafting an unforgettable thread woven through her senses.
We share, time stands still in this moment fair, as springtime fills the air. They've made arrangements with the crown, a marriage to the royal son. I've never seen his face at all, and now my waiting has begun.
The arrival of the Leviathan, a notorious pirate ship, safely within Estolian waters marked a pivotal moment in my life. That morning, I was unaware of the profound guidance I would receive, nor did I foresee discovering my Kaylee. Unpredictably, Ephraim, a crew member of this feared vessel, stepped ashore, destined to become one of the most extraordinary figures to grace Estolia. In my life, there are scarce few days of true significance, yet this day stood above the rest, not only for my personal joy, but for the profound impact on our nation. The news of the Leviathan threading the Needle, a treacherous path believed impenetrable to outsiders, seemed a dire omen at first. Yet, as events unfolded, it was clear that Deity's watchful presence guided us, helping us see beyond the peril to the moments that would define our future. Kytheros, Capitulo 42.
The sound of Ulysses' crutches caught her attention, and she turned to look at him. He smiled at her. His smile transformed his expression.
Our seclusion chamber is one of our better achievements as a people. You must choose to accept the prince as your spouse. If you choose him, and he chooses you, then you will become a princess. The two of you will remain in seclusion for a full 7 days.
He limped closer to her, his eyes seriously studying hers.
Do you plan to take this challenge, Annabel?
The scent of the blossoms reminded her of the mother she remembered before the accident with the horse. It felt as if her mother was present, offering reassurance that she was in a welcoming place, and, as Kytheia had said, her future was here. She mirrored that assurance.
If the prince will accept me, then I will accept him.
She lifted her chin defiantly against those forces that sought to deny her a future due to her mother's injury. He limped closer and took her hands in his, looking at her, as if he was searching for something he had lost in the depths of her eyes. Whatever he saw must have reassured him. He smiled slightly and then stepped backwards.
I believe, Annabel, daughter of Raoul, chief artisan of Palmara, that you were brought here by Deity and that you will find great happiness here.
He turned to limp to the right where a table had a bowl of fruit, along with a couple of goblets and a container of wine.
Everything you need is here in this chamber. The prince will arrive in a few minutes.
After a slight bow, he limped to the door and exited swiftly. Annabel decided to explore the chamber while she was alone. Against one wall stood a wooden table, adorned with a loaf of bread and a wheel of cheese. Turning her attention elsewhere, she noticed a cozy sitting area where large pillows were arranged on fine sheepskins. She imagined sitting there with the prince, engaging in conversation, discovering the nuances of her new homeland, provided he enjoyed such exchanges. Some men, she mused, preferred minimal interaction, their focus limited to bearing heirs. Yet with a full 7 days of seclusion ahead, surely they would need to converse about more than just progeny. A heavy tapestry concealed the rest of the chamber. Approaching it, near the open shutters overlooking the central garden, she slipped into the bedchamber. There, she paused, mesmerized by the sight of the bed. Though her father was wealthy, he owned nothing of this splendor. She stepped closer to examine it. The bed was expansive, easily fitting too. It rested on a metal platform layered with wood, topped by a plush mattress, dressed in exquisite linens. She reached out, feeling the smooth fabric and the comforting embrace of the mattress. Surely even Duke Ortega himself lacked such luxury. Having finished her scrutiny of the bed, she turned to take in the rest of the chamber. At the foot of the bed stood a wooden chest, solid and unadorned. 2 doors branched off from the bedchamber, their mysteries reserved for another time. She returned to the outer room, her mind restless with thoughts of how soon she might meet the man destined to be her husband, if she managed to please him. She wandered into the garden and found solace under the blossoming tree. As she closed her eyes, she inhaled the fragrant air, memories of her mother flooding back, her deep chestnut-brown hair, light brown eyes that sparkled with warmth. High cheekbones framed her face, along with generous curves. Taller than most women, she stood just a few inches shorter than Annabel's father. Her ever-present smile seemed to carry happiness wherever she went, lighting up every room she entered. Annabel often pondered how anyone could consider her more beautiful than her mother. She was shorter than average, with less generous curves, and her hair was black and curly, resembling her father's. Her eyes were a pale blue, a marked contrast to her mother's warm, light brown gaze. A faint rustle jolted her eyes open. She turned toward the shutters, her heart leaping at the sight of Alexandros standing in the doorway, gazing at her.
Has the king changed his mind?
She asked, a flicker of hope dancing in her chest. In that fleeting second, she wished fervently that the decision had shifted, longing for Alexandros over anyone else.
No, he has not.
Alexandros gestured for her to return to the seclusion chamber. As she entered, the soft glow of candles revealed the space, casting a warm light across the room. She noticed his freshly bathed and shaved appearance, and realization dawned on her.
You are the king's son?
She asked, astonishment ringing in her voice. He moved gracefully to the wine, pouring 2 glasses with practiced ease.
Have a seat, Annabel,
he invited, gesturing toward a nearby chair. His fluency in the language of Palmara was remarkably impressive, each word spoken with a natural cadence. Settling into the chair, she accepted the glass of wine he offered. As the rich taste enveloped her senses, she was caught off guard by its complexity. She gazed at the glass, marveling at how such depth of flavor came from the mellow golden liquid.
You did not wish to marry me?
She asked. Her curiosity mingled with a hint of vulnerability. He glanced at her swiftly, his gaze sharpening with alertness.
On the contrary,
he replied, a slow smile spreading across his face, a spark igniting in his eyes.
I had hoped to approach this differently, but my intentions were always to end up here, with you.
Annabel's gaze shifted from him to take in the room.
Here? Exactly?
Yes, here, in this very room,
he affirmed, his eyes following hers. With a casual nod toward the table, he added,
Would you like some bread, cheese, some fruit?
She nodded, observing as he broke off some bread and offered it to her. They ate in tranquil silence, a shared camaraderie settling between them. Annabel studied his features, her curiosity deepening. One question lingered in her mind.
Ulysses only ever called you the prince. Will you become king someday?
He nodded, a hint of gravity in his expression.
Yes, if you accept me, you'll stand by my side as my queen.
He took a thoughtful sip of his wine, letting the words settle. Annabel found herself momentarily at a loss for words.
Your father is quite vigorous. You likely will not be king for some time.
The crown prince of Anoxes was almost as old as this man's father. Her father often said the likelihood was that he would never take the crown. His father did not intend to die while his son was young enough to take it. Alexandros smiled warmly.
In Estolia, tradition dictates that the king abdicates his throne exactly 7 days after his heir's first son enters the world. Imagine this time next year. Should you choose me, I will be king.
His words left her speechless, so she concentrated on the food and wine. They shared the meal in a quiet companionship. Once finished, her mind drifted back to her earliest vivid memory of this land, the echoes of Estrella's squeals and his powerful stallion entwined. A warm blush crept across her cheeks at the thought. His expression shifted, and after a brief pause he rose to his feet, offering her his hand. She accepted, rising with his help. He stood tall and solid, a striking contrast to Duke Ortega's bulk. The Duke carried his extra weight with pride, but she found no admiration in such indulgence.
Has Ulysses said anything to you?
He inquired, gently guiding her towards the bedchamber. Reflecting on his words, she replied,
Ulysses said, I must choose you, and, likewise, you must choose me. That's the only way forward. I told him I would accept the prince.
A wistful expression crossed her face, recalling the hesitant doubts she harbored. She yearned for the man before her, even as she committed to another. He lifted the tapestry for her to pass beneath, letting it fall softly behind them like a veil. He approached the garden shutters, methodically pulling them closed, the quiet creak of the hinges breaking the stillness. Once the shutters were secured, he released another tapestry which dropped into place, sealing off the outside world.
It seemed to me as if you were hesitant to pledge yourself to me.
He probed. She shook her head in denial.
It is not that.
Her cheeks flushed as the unspoken words lingered on her lips.
What is it then, Annabel?
He pressed gently. Lowering her eyes, she bowed her head, wrestling with her emotions. He moved across the room, positioning himself in front of her. With a soft touch, he lifted her chin, his gaze searching hers.
What brings that blush to your cheeks?
Ulysses made me promise to do what was necessary, but in that moment, I secretly wished you were the prince.
And now that you know who I truly am?
He asked softly, his eyes locked onto hers.
Ulysses said I had to choose the prince before anything could move forward. Now, I understand the true meaning of his words. Choosing you, Alexandros, is my choice.
As she stepped closer, her body brushed softly against his.
I want you to choose me in return. Cathaya told me that happiness would elude me if I did not choose to live my life on Pequeño. I felt forced to accept and choose the prince, when all I could think about was how much I wanted you.
Oh, beautiful, wonderful Annabel. From the moment I first laid eyes on you, I knew my heart was yours. I've envisioned you as my future wife, the mother of our children, and my cherished Kaylee. The sole barrier that remained was in getting you to accept me in return.
But something in me starts to rise, a strength I didn't understand. I am more than they believe, more than just arranged to be. Tide has turned, the stars align above. Annabelle's heart overflowing with love. Destiny's call in Estolia's embrace, a trespasser's journey, finding time and grace.
I gazed at my sleeping grandson, who clutched a stuffed unicorn, enchanted by the gentle arc of his lashes casting shadows over his cheeks. There's something about the vulnerable calm of a child asleep in their bed that always brings tears to my eyes. I remember the day Miracle was born and my fervent prayers to someday see her healthy and safely asleep, just like this, 5 years later. In that moment, Deity spoke to my soul, promising I would see her grandson slumbering peacefully like this. Could I truly witness my newborn daughter's grandson at age 5? I turned 50 the day Miracle was born, and if she married at 18, her grandson would be 5 when I was 103 years old. Xavier was right about my longevity, I realized, as I marveled at young Zarin. I did not feel my age. How could I? I felt no different than I felt when I was 67, and my youngest daughter took Zarin's soul into her keeping. Lazarus, Ezekiel, Zacharian, Capitulo 88, Postscript.
She was unsure of what would come next, yet awed by the bright future Cathaya envisioned so clearly. A sense of destiny filled her heart, now that she knew for sure this man was to be hers.
Come with me, Annabel,
he bid, guiding her to a corner of the chamber she hadn't yet explored. They passed by the bed with its grand chest at the foot, moved beyond the tapestry shutting out the world, and towards the extra-wide arched doorway. Each tile was a masterpiece, a gold 8-pointed star at its heart, framed by a lush green matching the fresh leaves of garden trees outside. The green seamlessly shifted into the azure blue akin to shallow sea waters, and finally deepened into a rich, regal purple. The vibrant tiles invigorated Annabel, making her feel renewed. Her gaze moved from the sweeping tiles to the room's furnishings. Directly ahead, she noticed a table with a basin resting upon it, a large jug of water poised beside it. To her left stood a chamber pot, a reminder of life's necessities. The thought of impending intimacy with this man made her cheeks warm with a sudden blush. The crowning jewel of the room was a magnificent tub to the right. As she watched, she could see and hear water cascading in, realizing that hot water was being added through some ingenious device. On the far side, she noticed a sluice, perfectly positioned for the water to drain into the stream, winding through the narrow garden outside. She watched Alexandros intently, curiosity and anticipation lingering in the air.
Do you like it?
He asked, his voice unexpectedly vulnerable, reminiscent of a child seeking approval. She stepped closer to him with a warm smile.
Duke Ortega of Parma boasted of having the finest, yet what he possessed pales compared to this. I am beyond impressed, Alexandros. I'm in awe of the sheer delight it brings.
She felt the well of emotion rising within her, and knew she must manage herself soon.
Are you certain you want to choose me? Ulysses mentioned it was an irrevocable step.
He stepped closer, gently placing his hands on her shoulders.
I am certain, Annabel,
he assured her, his voice steady and sincere. Taking her hands, he guided them to the fastenings of his shirt.
Will you undress me?
He whispered, his words soft and inviting. Annabel preferred silence over discussing the weighty decision they had both embraced. Any conversation could invite a flicker of doubt in him, and that was not a risk she was willing to take. With her gaze fixed on the task, she concentrated on keeping her hands steady, unfastening each button with deliberate care. Piece by piece his clothing fell away until only his underpants remained. She hesitated then, her eyes searching his for assurance. His smile was soft, yet his eyes told a different story. Something intense and burning lay within them. There was a slight flush to his cheeks, and a hint of tension marked his features.
May I undress you, Annabel?
He asked, his voice a mix of anticipation and tenderness. Unable to trust her voice, she simply nodded. He wasted no time in removing her dress, leaving her in only a delicate set of underpants. The hiss of additional hot water entering the steaming tub filled the room, followed by the decisive click of the water access door closing. He put an arm around her shoulders and guided her towards the large bath. His hands settled over her hips, gently pushing her final item of apparel to the floor. As she gracefully stepped out of them, he murmured softly,
Let me help you into the tub.
She noticed his flushed cheeks had deepened in color as he extended his hand to her. Placing her hand in his, she stepped into the invitingly warm water. Settled comfortably, her eyes were drawn to his hands as they moved to the waistband of his underpants. The sight of his aroused body sent an involuntary wave of heat to her cheeks, evoking the memory of his stallion's primal claiming of her filly. He stepped into the tub beside her, sinking down with ease until he was comfortably settled. Following his example, she discovered that while the tub had seemed quite spacious, it was just the right size to accommodate both of them cozily.
You are so beautiful, Annabelle,
he whispered with a sense of wonder.
I am blessed to have you, and in awe that you've chosen me.
No more than I,
she replied. Her words were filled with sincerity. He turned slightly, reaching for a cake of soap. With a warm smile, he extended it to her and asked,
Will you wash me?
She nodded, accepting the soap and the soft cloth he offered. Soon the room filled with a heady fragrance, mirroring the scent of blossoms from the narrow garden outside. She lathered his chest and upper arms, her gaze locking with his. His expression of pleasure encouraged her to set the soap back in its dish and gently run her wet hands over his upper body, slowly rinsing away the suds. Once she finished, he took the soap and submerged it briefly, pausing to ask her,
May I wash you?
In response, she smiled softly and waited to see what he would do. He brought the soap to her shoulders, gently lathering her upper arms. After submerging the soap once more, he worked it between his hands, building up a rich lather. Setting it aside, he reached towards her, his soapy hands cupping both breasts. He washed beneath each full breast, and then focused his attention on each hardened crest. Once their bodies glistened equally clean, he stood up, guiding her to follow. He lathered her abdomen and legs with the soap, then handed it to her with a warm smile, inviting her to return the favor. She hesitated briefly upon noticing his arousal, but he gently guided her soapy hands to explore his thighs and the rest of him. Soon they were both fully lathered, and he pulled her into his arms, sharing a soft kiss. He then encouraged her to sit back in the water to rinse off, doing the same himself before stepping out of the bath. With a gentle smile, he opened the drain and picked up a large bath towel, holding it ready for her. Once she was standing on the exquisite tiles, he enveloped her in the towel, gently rubbing it over her body, drying her completely. He used the towel on himself, then draped it over the end of the tub. With a reassuring touch, he led her back to the bedchamber.
Annabelle,
he murmured,
I am going to give my soul into your keeping. You are my greatest blessing, and I thank Deity for the opportunity to have you in my life.
She gazed at the man addressing her, feeling more at ease with him, standing naked in the bedchamber than she had ever felt in her life before this moment.
Alexandros, I may not grasp everything you say, but I am entrusting my entire future into your hands.
He opened his arms wide, and she instantly flowed into his embrace. The warmth of his chest against her breasts was exhilarating, complemented by the strength of his arms holding her close. In moments, their kiss ignited with a passionate fervor, and they began exploring each other with wild abandon. The opulence of fine linens and the bed's luxurious comfort were faint whispers against her senses, overshadowed by the electric feel of his skin under her fingertips, the shudder-inducing caress of his hands on her body, the intimate musk of his scent, and the tangy, salty taste of his skin consumed her. It was only when his hand ventured between her legs, touching her most sensitive area, that her maiden instincts flared, prompting her legs to close defensively. She met his gaze, expecting to find censure, but instead saw a smoldering intensity that matched her own desire. As she relaxed her thighs, his hand gently cupped her once more. A soft gasp escaped her lips when a finger brushed against her sensitive nerve endings, igniting a yearning deep within. Realizing she craved more than just his touch, she settled back onto the mattress, pulling him close over her. The sensation of his body claiming hers resonated through her entire being. The sheer pleasure of their union was beyond anything she could have imagined. Instinctively, her hands and body found the perfect rhythm, moving in harmony with his. An eternity later, they both gasped as an overwhelming rush of ecstasy coursed through them simultaneously. He stilled above her, his body heavy and spent, whispering something in the local dialect. As he finally pulled away, a stray thought crossed her mind. She couldn't help but wonder if Estrella had felt a similar pleasure when his stallion had claimed her.
You keep my soul, Annabelle. In 7 days, at the end of our seclusion, we will be wed for all time.
She sighed deeply in contentment, enjoying the sound of his heart beating in her ear. It seemed surreal that she had woken with the dawn on this island, and now, before dusk had settled, they were betrothed. She recalled the leap of faith she and Estrella took from Theros' ship, the fear that clenched her heart as they were immersed in the water. But her faith had been rewarded. They had reached the promised future that Cathaya had foreseen.
Salt stings her eyes, a blurring hazy dream. Washed ashore it would seem. Estolia's coast, a foreign golden hue, a trespasser's fate, uncertain, starkly new. But fate, it dances a cruel